All right, if you have your Bible, Ecclesiastes chapter 7. We're going to look at a few verses. Now, I will tell you, I do everything on my iPad, and one of the cool things about when I do everything in pages is it tells me a word count. Normally on a Wednesday night and Sunday, it's like between 2,200 and 3,400 words. But tonight, I want to tell you because I'm super proud of this, and I literally stopped typing as soon as I got here. But I stopped typing just for a second. I looked down at the word count, and the word count was 1776. So I just stopped typing because I thought, man, what a perfect, what a perfect way to celebrate America by cutting it off at 1776 and starting from there. So Ecclesiastes chapter 7 tonight, and that really is true. It literally has 1776. That's great. What I want to do tonight is I want to give us an illustration right off the rip here at the beginning that's going to kind of work through this text tonight with us. So I want you to remember this kind of initial text or this initial illustration so that you kind of think of it as we work through. But there was a man who loved to plant trees, and so what he did is that he not only took care of the soil, but he made sure that the tree, the saplings, or whatever you want to call them, that he chose to plant, he made sure that he chose the best ones, right? The ones that looked perfect, that were healthy, that were in good shape. And he planted them and he watered them as faithfully as he could water them. He pruned them with absolute care. And one day he goes out to the orchard and he is looking at the trees and he realizes that all the trees have grown straight except for one. In the middle of this beautiful, well kept orchard, there is one tree that has grown crooked. And he's a perfectionist, so this bothers him. So he does everything he can to try and fix this situation, right? So he uses rope, he tries stakes, he tries everything that you can imagine to try to straighten this tree out. And finally, he steps back and he realized something, that even though the tree was crooked, it was still strong. It was still growing, and it was still producing fruit. Life for most people in this world feels like that crooked tree, right? You look around in the middle of the world that you're living in, and even at church we do this. We look around and we think, man, so and so, they've got their life together. Everything just kind of falls into place, like that everything's firing on all cylinders for them. They don't have a problem in the world, right? We look around and we think that, and people do that all around the world, or all around in our communities. When we go out and about, we look around and we think, man, I wish that my life was like that, right? That it was not the crooked tree, but instead the one that's there and it looks perfect and there's no flaw, there's nothing. We want things to go straight. We want things to make sense. We want things in our life to follow a predictable pattern. That's what we want. But the fact of the matter is, that's not the way that life works. And you can want all day. And I won't tell you what my family used to say about want. They used to say to want in one hand and there, something else in another one, and see which one gets full first, right? But I mean, that's just it. But you can want all you want, but just because you want something doesn't mean it's going to happen, right? That's not the way that the world works. But here's the thing about it: just like that guy who planted the orchard, what he realized when he stepped back is just because things didn't go the way he wanted doesn't mean they were broken. Doesn't mean they were wrong. It doesn't mean they were unhealthy or that it wasn't working right. It just meant that crooked tree didn't fit within his plan, but it still fit within his plan, right? And for us in this life, one of the things that Solomon is going to say tonight that I think is incredibly important for us, all of us, to remember is that God is sovereign over the mountaintops, but he's also sovereign over the valley. When we're going through it, when life is a mess for you, it's not that God has turned his back on you. It's not that God has abandoned you. It's just the the way that life works. Right? It's not all life is not every day waking up and the sun rising over the ocean because you're at the beach and the weather is perfect. No. Sometimes we wake up in the storms of life and we wonder what's going to happen. And God is just as sovereign in one of those situations as he is in the other one. And it means that God is sovereign over the uncertainties that we have in this life. And so the question is, how do we respond to that? Because that becomes the important part. Is what do we do in the midst of life's uncertainties? And I would encourage you as we look through this text tonight to see that what Solomon is pointing out is that we have two responses, humility and wisdom. Those are our two responses, other than the ones that we like to run to the most, which are frustration and fear. You see, there's healthy ways. Right? There's healthy ways to look at that crooked tree. There's healthy ways to look at the valleys in your life and the storms in your life. And there are healthy ways to deal with those things too. God's wisdom calls for us to trust him. Period. When we're prosperous and when we're poor. When we're feeling really good and when we're feeling really bad, when we have complete clarity on a situation and when we have no clarity on a situation. He calls us to trust him, but he also calls us to something else too, and that's to avoid extremes, right? Which is a dangerous place to be. Now, what Solomon is going to point out to us tonight is the extremes are self-righteousness or recklessness. Right? And we're going to see that as we work through the text. Instead, what Solomon points us to is whether we're on the valley or whether we're on the mountain, there's one thing that drives us, and it's a healthy fear of the Lord. And again, a healthy fear of the Lord. That's not being scared or afraid, but it's the awe, it's the reverence that we have for our Creator and our King. He says this beginning in verse 13 of chapter 7, Ecclesiastes, "Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful, and in the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. In my vain life, I have seen everything. There's a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who prolongs his life in evil doing. But be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It's good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand, for the one who fears God shall come out from both of them." In verse 13, "Consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked." Solomon comes to the table and he points us to the reality that sometimes the best thing we can do is close our mouth. Sometimes the best thing that we can do is be still and know that he is God. Right? We know that from the scripture. Sometimes the best thing we can do is to take a minute to pause, to reflect on the reality of the situation and on the reality that there is not a situation that you're going through that is outside of the control of God. There's nothing that we can take to God and he's not equipped to handle. And so, for us, this is where it becomes really difficult, because for us, we want to control everything, right? I mean, maybe you don't, but that's in my own life. Like my hope is that I can control every situation, that nothing ever gets out of hand, that everything always goes perfectly according to what I think perfect looks like in a given situation. But the truth of the matter is that's not a healthy way to live. Because I didn't make life. I didn't create life. I'm not responsible for maintaining life. All of those things belong to our Creator, the one who has power over all of those things. And so sometimes what we have to do as human beings, when we take a step back and we look at the crooked tree, sometimes we just need to take a step back and say, God, um, your ways are far beyond my ways, and I don't understand, but I trust. And sometimes just saying that out loud can speak to our own hearts, right? Because we may believe that in our minds, but to say it out loud and to continue to say it out loud, God, we acknowledge that your ways are beyond our ways. God, I don't understand this situation and circumstance, Lord, but I trust you. I trust you. Why? Well, who can make straight what God has made crooked? What do you think that you can bring to the table and add to the situation that can fix the situation and circumstance that you may find yourself in? There are difficulties, there are trials, there are circumstances that you don't understand and you're not going to understand. So what can you do to fix that? The answer is nothing, right? There's nothing you can do. If you don't understand, then you're not going to have a solution. But all of those things, good, bad, and ugly, are determined by God's will, just like the crooked tree, right? Just because it couldn't be straightened by human efforts doesn't mean that all of a sudden life is barreling out of control. Right? It just means that sometimes in the economy of God, the best thing that we can do is not only be still and know that He is God, but realize that no matter how hard we try, there are certain things that we're not going to have the solution to. I would give you the illustration that there's not a worldly solution to the issue of death. Right there, I saw an article recently about some place that like they'll freeze you or whatever, and hopefully in 5,000 years thaw you out. And guess what? You'll be just as dead when they freeze you as when they thaw you out in 5,000 years. Right? Nothing changes. We're not going to be able to undo death, right? It's a reality. It's a promise. It's literally a result of sin entering the world. And so why would we fight against the things we can't control? Why would we spend our time trying to come up with solutions for things that are completely outside of our control? What if we just trust God and we keep pushing on? What if we just trust God and we keep trucking forward, right? Right? What if we do that instead of stopping, right? Because here's the thing I can promise you. When you're in the valley, the worst thing you can do is stop. Because you know what? I can guarantee you that the situation you're in the valley, if you stop, you're not getting out. You're not. Because it takes momentum, it takes movement in order to come out of that. And so we have to always be pushing forward. But the wisdom that Solomon is giving to us is that we do that not from the place of trying to fix everything or trying to have control over everything, but from a place of faith, from a place of trust. God, I don't know what you're doing in this diagnosis. I don't know what you're doing in this family, in this situation, this circumstance. God, I don't know what you're doing. But what I do know is every day you wake me up with a mission and a purpose to live for your glory and honor. And I'm just going to keep moving forward. I'm just going to keep doing what I know I ought to do. And I'm going to trust that no matter if I'm in this valley for 3 minutes, for 3 years, or 30 years, that if I just keep moving forward, one day I'm going to be out of this. And it may be that I die, and that's what takes me out of this, but I kept moving forward. I kept running forward. I kept moving. In the day of prosperity, be joyful, and in the day of adversity, consider God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. When God blesses us with good times, we are joyful. We receive them with gratitude. with joy. We recognize them as gifts. But the flip side of that is that God tells us right here through Solomon that the other side of this coin, when we face difficulties, we are not called to be a reactionary people. We are called to be a reflective people. Adversity in our life isn't random. Right? God allows us to go through things so that we'll grow, so that we'll learn dependence on Him, so that we'll learn a deeper understanding of His ways. God does that stuff. Why? Because, listen, the times I've learned the most in my life have not been the times when things are easy. Right? It's when God brings me through the valley that I learn the most. Why? Well, because that's the nature of fallen humanity. Right? We prefer the hard way instead of the easy one, right? Let's look back to Genesis chapter 3. There was one rule in all the world, and don't eat from one tree. And we couldn't even do that, right? We couldn't even follow that. And don't worry, if you would have been there, you'd have done the same thing, right? And so nothing in this world, nothing in this life is random. So when we experience the blessing of God, we recognize it as the blessing of God. And when we experience adversity, we recognize that this is an opportunity that God is giving us to grow, giving us a chance to view things in a right perspective, understanding that God is sovereign over all of this. There's nothing that happens that is outside of His control. Even when God doesn't let us know His plans. Even when God doesn't let us know what the future holds. Even when we don't fully understand it, even when we can't predict what the outcome will be. Which brings us to a place, it should, of humility. Right? When we understand that the story's already been written. Your story has already been written before the foundation of the world. The God of creation knew every moment of every day of your life from beginning to end. He knows all the good, the bad, and the ugly. And every day, God turns the page of that story. And you don't know what's on the next page. You trust. You trust that when your time on earth is done, that page will end your story on this side of eternity, right? And begin the story on the other side, right? We trust in Him with all of that. And it makes sense, right? Because, again, we can't control what comes next. We can't. I mean, yeah, we play a part in things, right? I'm going to walk to my car. I'm going to crank the car and do all that. Yeah, I'm going to do that stuff. But the truth of the matter is that faith is understanding that I'm not in control of anything, right? Because even when I get on the road and I'm in control of my vehicle, there's a whole lot of other yahoos out there that I'm putting my faith in that they have control of theirs too, right? There's a dependence that happens that comes from faith. And for us who believe in God, our dependence rests solely on God and God alone. And I would say to you that He's the best person for you to depend on because He's the only one that's never failed. He's the only one who keeps all of His promises always. And just because we may not understand what He's doing, it doesn't mean that Romans 8:28 is out the window. It doesn't mean that God is punishing us, right? Just because you're in the valley doesn't mean God is mad at you. Doesn't mean God is disciplining you. It doesn't always mean that. Sometimes it does. But what it means is us looking at the reality of the situation and circumstance and saying, God, it doesn't matter why this is happening. The reality is that I believe in you, and I have faith in you, and I have faith in the promise of your word that all things are working together for our good and your glory. And when things go well, we respond with joy and with gratitude. And when trials come, we don't boo-hoo. Right? We don't woe is me. We reflect on those trials and tribulations, and we ask God, what is your purpose? God, give me wisdom in this situation and circumstance. We're limited. We're the limited ones. That should drive us to trust in God above all else and above everyone else and everything else. Listen to what Solomon says in response to this. In my vain life, I've seen everything. There's a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who prolongs his life in evil doing. Solomon says, man, I've said all of this so far, right, about the incredible life that I've lived, the incredible things that I've seen, but life is full of so many contradictions, isn't it? And if you don't believe me, good, don't. Just look at what he says, because I think he gives us a pretty good example of the contradictions that exist in this life, right? There's a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, right? We expect righteousness to be rewarded, right? If we're living for the glory and honor of God, we expect that God would bless that and honor that with good things and with longevity in life. But the truth of the matter is that righteous people suffer. Righteous people die young, even though they were faithful. And on the flip side of that, there's a wicked man who prolongs his life in evil doing. Solomon says it's not just the weird contradiction of life is that you can live a righteous life and you may still suffer hardship, you may still struggle with doubt, you may still struggle with a lot of things, and then there may be your neighbor who has no belief about anything, who just says, I believe we evolved from cosmic sludge from millions of years ago, and they are living their best life. Everything is falling into place for them. They have the biggest house and the nicest cars, and everything is going right for them. Solomon says that's the contradiction of this life. And Solomon says, in my life, I've seen all of that. In my vain life, in my fleeting life, I've seen all of that. And again, it drives us to ask the question, right? It drives humanity to ask the question. Humanity's asked for millions, actually not millions, thousands of years. Sorry, Ken Ham. Thousands of years. We've asked the question, why do bad things happen to good people? Because nowhere in Scripture are good people immune from bad things. You can't turn to a place and show me where it says that, well, because you believe in Jesus, you're now immune from hardship. That you're going to be healthy, wealthy, and blessed. You'll be blessed, but blessed in God's way and in God's time. Solomon says in verse 16, be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Now, what is he talking about there? He's not talking about abandoning righteousness. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about self-righteousness, legalism, right? Trying to manipulate God through your good behavior, right? And I'm not confessing to this, but there may have been times in my life where I tried to make a pact with God. God, I'll do this, right? Or I'll stop doing this if you'll do this, right? Do that sort of mumbo jumbo. And really what Solomon says is that's self-righteousness. Right? It's legalism. It's trying to manipulate God by offering something that God doesn't need. The earnest desire of God's heart is that you would love Him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And that would be manifest in your life. That's the earnest desire of God's heart. God's not in the business of bargaining. God is not Shark Tank, right? Where you go to Him and you throw out these ideas and you ask Him for, God, I'll give you 15% of my heart if you give me $300,000, right? That's not the way God works. Don't make yourself too wise. Wisdom is valuable, but pride is not. You know how many smart people are some of the most obnoxious people on the planet? Right? Smart people who are humble, those are the people you love to be around. Smart people who are arrogant, prideful, nobody wants to be around them. Those people who have an obsession with trying to figure everything out. Right? We're gonna get to the bottom of this. We're gonna figure this out. Right? And they just keep pushing, even when it's clear that there's not an answer. Even when it's clear that there's not a worldly solution to the problem. They keep pushing and pushing and pushing. Why? Because they're trusting in that intellectual part of them. And the truth is, someone like that generally finds himself frustrated and in complete despair. Because there are a lot of things in this world that we will not have the answer to on this side. And you can live your life running after those things, but Solomon tells you where that's going to lead. You see, if you are self-righteous, if you have this sort of intellectual pride that's obnoxious and sinful, he asks the question, why would you destroy yourself? If you're a legalist, if you're pursuing self-righteousness, if you're pursuing intellectual pride and righteousness, you're going to be real upset when life doesn't go your way. Listen, I'm a living, breathing example of this. I'm a perfectionist in my life. I can't tell you how many times in school, in college, and in seminary, and in my doctoral work where I got into it with my professors, right? Because I did it. I did what they asked me to do, and I thought it was right and as right as it could be, and they ripped me to shreds, right? And instead of being humble and learning from that, there were times where I was not so humble. And we'll just leave it at that. I was self-righteous, to say the least. But we learn from those things, right? We learn that there's no place in the economy of God for self-righteous people. Because self-righteousness doesn't help. Not when I acted that way, it didn't help anything. You think my grade went up? No. You think they destroyed me even worse the next time? Yes. Right? There was a lot of humility that was gained through those endeavors. Right? And that's what God does. He shows us all of this and says, listen, true righteousness is humility, and it's dependence on God, and it's not self-invented or self-exalting. Right? It's weird to me, the amount of Christians that exist in this world, and you listen to them talk about things, you listen to them talk about life, and it's so weird because at the center of the universe is not God, it's them. And it's just weird to hear people talk like that, but I see it all the time on Facebook and everywhere else. People who I know that live that way. People who try to control life through moral perfectionism. You know people like that? They're always looking down their nose at everyone else because they've got it and everybody else is always wrong, and they're never wrong. They always have the moral high ground. They can never admit their own faults and their own failures and their own flaws. Self-righteous. Don't be overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? Listen, the Bible is 100% clear. All sin is serious. All sin is bad. That's an inescapable reality. But deliberately indulging in sin as if it has no consequences is woo, it's all those drugs I'm on. For my kidney stones. I have indigestion so bad. I don't know what it is. Yeah, that's right. But when we deliberately indulge in sin, when we act like what we're doing has no consequence, man, that's a bad place to be in, right? That's a terrible mentality to have. Living in open rebellion against God, thinking that everything is fine, thinking that there's going to be no consequence, right? That's a crazy mentality to have. if you're living in open rebellion against God, you should understand that there's consequences that come along with that. God's discipline will fall. We shouldn't be surprised by those things. And what Solomon says here is that, well, those are the sorts of things that lead to destruction. And the word, he says, neither be a fool. If you're looking at Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, when you see fool or foolishness, what he's talking about, generally what it's talking about are two things, probably one of two things, or both. Moral recklessness and spiritual recklessness. And Solomon says if you live without regard for God or wisdom, that's a really incredible, dangerous path to walk. Why? Why should you die before your time? Sinful living leads to premature ruin. Whether it's moral failure, whether it's destructive habits, or even if it's God's judgment. So what does Solomon say? Legalism is dangerous, but so is the other side of this. Yes, legalism is incredibly dangerous because it can lead you to a path of pride and arrogance and a lack of humility. But he says on the flip side of this is that lawlessness is just as bad. Living like hell Monday through Saturday and thinking you darken the door of a Sunday and a Wednesday and all of a sudden you're going to be all right with God, that's a terrible and terrifying way to live. Because one thing is clear from Scripture, sin carries real consequences. And if you live a life of wickedness, if you pursue wickedness, it's going to lead to physical and spiritual destruction. The wages of sin is death. So if you're out there running your race after your own sinful desires and your own sinful heart, you're going to die in that. It doesn't mean you're going to die young, but it could be. Could be. God could prolong as you live and move and breathe in that wickedness, but it doesn't free you from the judgment that comes. Solomon says it's good that you should take hold of this. And from that, withhold not your hand. For the one who fears God shall come out from both of them. We need a balance in our life as Christians. We need balance. We have to avoid the self-righteous legalism. We have to avoid the reckless wickedness. There has to be this other way. There has to be another way. And Solomon says the other way is the fear of the Lord. It's the fear of the Lord. The key to navigating this life, the key to working through the uncertainty in this life is the fear of the Lord. Again, what is the fear of the Lord? It's healthy reverence for God that leads to a balanced and faithful life. It keeps you on the road, right? It keeps you from running off the road to either side, to the side of legalism or the side of license is the one way of putting it. Lawlessness, another way of putting it. We have to keep in the middle. We have to stay on the road, and that road is paved with the fear of the Lord. And a person who is God-fearing recognizes that they're limited, right? A God-fearing person recognizes they don't have all the answers. A God-fearing person trusts in the sovereignty of God. Listen, I've said this a million times in my life, and it's still true today. If I go to the doctor tomorrow and they tell me that my time is running out, then it just is what it is. God hasn't failed, right? God hasn't cut my life short. God hasn't done anything other than be the sovereign God of creation, and He wrote my story a long time ago, and there's nothing that I'm going to do to change that story. God doesn't have an eraser. And the beauty of that is that means that when God saved me, God knew all the junk that I was going to bring to the table. God had already written the story. God already knew everything that I was going to do. right? God already knew all the sin that I had in my life and would have in my life, and He saved me anyway. And the story, because it's in Him, will end in only one place, and that's eternity with Him. The God-fearing people never forget that all of this hinge on Him. All of it hinges on Him. So we live wise lives, not rigid, legalist, but not reckless either. Even when life doesn't work out like we expect. Right? Even when things don't go our way. A wise person fears God and walks in balance. And that balance is found in a reverent relationship with God, not trying to control life through religious performance, but also not enjoying life through reckless living either. Sometimes the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper. We can't control and straighten out what God has made crooked. And Solomon says if we aren't careful in this world, we will fall into one of these two pits that are not good, equally not good, of self-righteousness that leads to pride and frustration, or reckless wickedness that leads to destruction. He said we trust. We trust in the God who's written our stories. We live in the fear of the Lord. And this wisdom, it's not a formula. Unfortunately, it's not if I do this, then this happens, and this. It doesn't work like that. We've seen that. The righteous suffer. The wicked prosper. It's a giant contradiction. But what it leads us as the people of God to is it leads us to that place of humble reverence, recognizing that, yeah, this life doesn't really make sense. And I'll be honest with you, I haven't really run into one thing in this life that really makes sense to me. So if you do, good on you. But I haven't found it yet. I really haven't. But I do trust that God has got this thing. And I trust that if we walk in His ways, that His ways are higher than ours, that His understanding far, far exceeds my understanding. And I think that when we understand that, then we walk much like a tightrope walker, if that makes sense. Right? That's literally what we're doing. Right? If that person is walking that tightrope, if they lean one side, gone, right? But guess what? If they lean the other side, still gone, right? It's that balanced, that focus on, listen, I have got to get to the other side. I am, and if our illustration carries over, I am running heavenward, what Paul says in Philippians 3, right? I forget what lies behind, focus on what lies ahead, right? I press on heavenward, right? We focus on what's ahead of us, and we balance out this life, understanding that, no, I'm not good enough, and I'm never going to be good enough to bring my righteousness to the table, right? And on the other side, we realize, hey, but just because I'm never going to be good enough doesn't mean that I don't try to live for the glory and honor of God. And so I'm not out there living like hell all the time, thinking that I'm going to be all right. No, there's a balance that happens. Why? Because my focus and my attention is heavenward. I know that there's an end goal in all of this. And I know that everything that happens with each step that I take does not change where I'm headed. Right? That tightrope walker, they don't care. Right? They don't care. They know that they're taking the next step, and they have one goal and one destination in mind. And for us as Christians, living and moving and breathing in this world, the same is true for us. Right? Yes, it is a delicate balance, but if we keep our eyes on God, then the fear of the Lord brings balance to our life, and we will walk through the valley with victory, and we will walk on the mountaintop with victory, all in humility. are you trying to straighten things that God has made crooked? This is really hard if you have a fixer personality, right? If you think that God has given you, and I understand if this is you, I understand. If in your mind, when you're faced with a situation and circumstance, you in your mind you got to fix it. But are you trying to straighten the things that God has made crooked? Or are you trusting in His plan rather than forcing your own? Are you leaning toward self-righteousness, thinking that somehow if you can just be good enough, then you'll get control over your life? Or are you leaning toward reckless sin, assuming that God's grace gives you a free pass? Both of those are dangerous. Are you walking in the fear of the Lord? We know from other scripture this is the foundation of wisdom. It's the fear of the Lord. What Solomon tells us in Ecclesiastes 7 is that the fear of the Lord is also the navigation tool by which we use to keep balance in our life. We keep our focus heavenward. If not, man, we end up here on this earth spinning our wheels. Spinning our wheels. Trying to do one of those two things, right? Trying to balance something that we can't balance. But if we just focus on Him, instead of trying to control everything, instead of trying to explain everything, what if we just trusted in the sovereignty of God? What if in the darkest moments of our life we could say with 100% certainty God has got this, and in the most incredible, bright, joyous moments of our life we could say the same thing? We can. We can. We can walk in wisdom. We can avoid the extremes. We can live in the fear of the Lord. Those are things that we can do. But we can only do those things when He is our focus, when He is our motivation, when He is our prize. Any questions about this?